the bear, or the bear got you.
That was famously off the Lost Gaucho album. The Lost Gaucho album is comprised of unreleased, fantastic songs that Steely Dan were contemplating putting out on what would eventually become the Gaucho album, which was released in November of 1980. The Bear and other fantastic songs are just an incredible reminder of the genius that is. The band is still with us, Steely Dan. And I thought, first of all, my name is Tim. I'm with, my channel is the University of Vinyl. I have been in the vinyl community now, making videos, celebrating records, record collecting, music on vinyl, vintage audio gear for about 1 year now. I think it was January 28th, 2021 that I decided to jump off the ledge and give this a shot. So thank you for tuning in if you're new to the channel. If you're not new, welcome back, and I appreciate everyone that continues to come back and view, and most especially, it's fantastic to kind of share in the love of music and record collecting, and comments are fantastic. I love to have the interaction is fantastic. It's one of the main reasons for doing this to begin with. So as part of a celebration of my first year in the vinyl community, I've really enjoyed it, and I thought, you know what, let's work on a kind of a special episode, and let's take a deep dive into the catalog of one of my most favorite artists ever, which is Steely Dan. I think this is important to try and document the best way possible to listen to this music. I am a protagonist for listening to music on vinyl. There are also going to be people who insist on high-res digital sources. Some people still like CDs. The main reason for this video is I just want to point out, and this is all in my opinion, which is dependent on my system, my ears, and the things that I have in my collection, things that I'm able to make an opinion on based on the listening that I've done. So I know there's going to be people who are going to disagree. I welcome any kind of disagreement. I welcome a debate. And I hope that everyone, if you have a different opinion, if you have something to share, you think one pressing of a particular album is better than the pressing that I'm talking about, by all means, please take a minute, write a comment, and let's discuss further in the comments. Now, very important, there are a lot of people who are just getting into collecting records. And there are also a lot of people who are just discovering what it is about Steely Dan. And I thought it would be interesting today to, like I said, document what I think are the best pressings available as far as record albums of the band Steely Dan. Have you seen this couple on YouTube? They're one of these large reaction accounts. You know, two people with headphones on, supposedly listening to a music or an album for the first time, and us kind of reflecting and watching in their enjoyment, hopefully their enjoyment of listening to something for the first time. I recently became aware of a couple named Nick and Alex, and these guys, I don't know if they're a couple or brother sister. They're probably a couple. I haven't dug that far into it, but they're pretty cool, and they're. I love the reactions that they're showing, listening. They're basically taking a deep dive on Steely Dan, or they've just recently done that or completed that. And I think a lot of people, a lot of younger folks, could be in the same boat where they're just discovering Steely Dan, and hopefully they're getting into record collecting and learning about listening to an analog source compared to just streaming. So that's what this video is all about. It took me a minute to get to the point, but today I'm going to be taking a deep dive. I'm going to be looking at the 9 studio albums released by Steely Dan between the years of 1972 and 2003. I'm going to be looking at the 1 live album that's available on vinyl, which was released in last year, 2021. And I'm going to be looking at 2 different greatest hits comps packages that are available on vinyl as well. So let's get started. Stay tuned. Thank you again, everybody, for joining in today. And again, please, I would love to have any kind of feedback, any kind of comments after you've had a chance to kind of digest everything. Shoot your comments in. Let's continue the interaction as we move forward. For the benefit of those who are not really familiar with Steely Dan, maybe it's important that we take a moment and just briefly outline the architecture of the band. So the 2 main architects and intellects behind the band, of course, are Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. These guys met in college in upstate New York, a place called Bard College, and this was in the late 1960s. And they eventually got together and formed a team. They originally wanted to be songwriters. The dream was to work out of the Brill Building, writing songs for Barbra Streisand and the like. Walter Becker died in 2017, and Donald Fagen put out a really nice statement at that point in time after Becker's death, talking about their relationship, and I just wanted to read a little blurb from Fagen. We started writing nutty little tunes on an upright piano in a small sitting room in the late 1960s. We bonded over our shared love of jazz from the 1920s through the mid-1960s, W.C. Fields, the Marx Brothers, science fiction, Nabokov, Kurt Vonnegut, Thomas Berger, and Robert Altman films. So just listening to that, these guys, they were kind of beating their own drum. Everyone knows the story behind how they named the band. If not, look it up. It's fantastic. And for the first album that they recorded in 1972 and released, of course, I'm talking about Can't Buy a Thrill. There were actually 3 lead vocalists on this album. There was Donald Fagen, there was David Palmer, and there was Jim Hodder. After the 3rd album, the main core of the band basically was dissolved, and Fagen and Becker would move forward primarily using session musicians, and they would reach back to the core band. Occasionally, 1 or 2 different players would have a different role on upcoming albums. Walter Becker's primary instrument was bass guitar, but he was also a very accomplished guitar player, and he had some incredible lead guitar solos and runs on various songs that we may touch on as we move forward. Fagen, of course, is a keyboard player, synthesizer, organ, Fender Rhodes. That's what he's most famous for. And he has an incredible feel and an incredible vocal style. Now, in the beginning, Fagen was a little stage, he had some stage fright, and he wasn't sure that he felt comfortable carrying all the tunes and being front and center, because the band, of course, was going to be performing live. They were expected to perform live. So they brought in David Palmer as a vocalist, and Palmer sang the lead vocal on the sweet but subversive Dirty Work. Palmer also sang lead vocal on Brooklyn Owes the Charmer Under Me. Jim Hodder sang lead vocal on Midnight Cruiser. This is an incredible opening statement for this band. So the band consisted of Donald Fagen, Walter Becker, Jeff Skunk Baxter on lead guitar, Denny Diaz on lead guitar as well, Jim Hodder on drums, and David Palmer on vocals. The two best pressings of note, and remember, there are people who are going to have differing opinions. For instance, I do know about the UK probe pressings. Those are highly regarded. But from my research, from my listening, I am recommending that if you want a very good sounding copy of this album, you need to go back and find an original ABC Records release on the Black label. The album was originally mastered by Doug Sachs at the Mastering Lab. So if you have a good, clean, early pressing on that ABC Black label, you've done most of the hard work as far as trying to source a good copy. And this record is rising in value quite quickly. It's difficult to find one that's clean. I am lucky enough to have an early ABC pressing. This pressing has a lot of life in it. There's great space and kind of air between the instruments. Really nice separation as far as stereo is concerned. Good soundstage and a very lively, dynamic, live sounding recording. Fantastic sound. Try and find an early Black label on the ABC label. Now there is another pressing to talk about, and that is the German audiophile label Speaker's Corners. And Speaker's Corner put out an audiophile release in 2007. Now, the median price on Discogs of that album pressing, if you can find one, is running at around $225 and up. They're not easy to find. They are very, very highly regarded, but in my research, and principally I'm talking about the Steve Hoffman forums. If you don't know about the Steve Hoffman forums, you need to check those out. But there are many, many, many pages-long threads concerning Steely Dan pressings, and the consensus seems to be that the early ABC labels beat out the Speaker's Corner label. When we're talking about audiophile pressings, there have been a few done over the years, but the Steely Dan catalog is really lacking in an overall, fantastic program of, like the Mo-Fi Van Halen one-steps that were recently announced. There's nothing like that for Steely Dan. One of the main reasons being, it seems like the master tapes for many of these albums have been lost. There's rumors of them being lost in the MCA fire in California years ago. There are reports of the original mixtapes in good condition, stored in a vault in MCA's vaults in Pennsylvania. So there's still hope there that maybe they will license this out for a proper, full reissue audiophile program. It would be fantastic. In the meantime, that's mainly the reason for this video. I want to try and point out the best sounding pressings that are currently available on the second-hand market today. That's the first album, Can't Buy a Thrill. And again, you want to try and find an early pressing on the black ABC label. Now, ABC did reissues of this label all the way into the 1980s. You may find them on a different style of ABC logo. They're called the concentric rings logo with kind of a cascading colors of orange, yellow, and red. And then you may find them, ABC Records had financial difficulties in the late 1970s. The entire record company was purchased, all their assets was purchased by MCA Records. And you will find MCA pressings of this album and all the Steely Dan albums. Other than Gaucho, you want to avoid the MCA label pressings. They are second and third generation copies from the master tapes. They don't have a lot of life in them, and they're just not highly recommended. Try and get as early of a pressing as you can find. Do some research on the Hoffman forums and move forward in that direction. The artwork on this first album is fantastic. Quite a kind of subversive cover, keeping on point with the entire kind of Steely Dan ethos. And we have kind of a muted group photograph with all of the lyrics. And one of my favorite parts of this album are the liner notes on the very back. These were written by Fagen and Becker themselves. They're very funny. They're very amusing. They reach out to basically the music nerd. They're talking about different instruments that were used, different effects that were used. So right out of the gate, Steely Dan were really kind of setting the tone and announcing to the world that they were a world apart from your typical classic rock band of the early 1970s. Can't Buy a Thrill, released in 1972, the very first Steely Dan album. Arriving 11 months later after Can't Buy a Thrill was Countdown to Ecstasy, the second Steely Dan album. It was originally released in August of 1973, and at this point the band had been touring on and off for the better part of a year. So recording sessions at the Village Recorders in West LA were set up kind of intermittently in between tour dates. Also at this point, David Palmer had been basically eliminated from the band. They had made a group decision that Fagen was going to continue as the lead singer on all the tracks, and there was no more need for David Palmer. This album is ranks high for me as one of my favorites in the discography. The band really started to flesh things out a little bit further. This has got a darker tone than the first album, which was sprinkled in with almost some poppy flavored songs. Countdown to Ecstasy, again, had a little more edge to it. One of the best tracks on the album, of course, is the Boston Rag. If you have not heard that recently, drop the needle at about the 3-minute mark of that song, and you will just be amazed. There is about a 1.5-minute solo interlude. First with Donald Fagen on electric piano, and then Jeff Skunk Baxter comes in with a very interesting kind of vibrato effect on his guitar before really going full tilt on an incredible distorted guitar solo. One of the best guitar solos on any Steely Dan song. That is the Boston Rag, one of my favorite songs. As far as pressings are concerned, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, just like the first album. The best thing that you can do is find an early press on the black ABC label. There were reissues later on that had the yellow and gold and red concentric circle label on the ABC label. But for best sound, you want to find a black ABC label. The UK Probe first issue is also highly regarded. I have not personally heard that, but I am making a note of it as something maybe to seek out to do a comparison. What I have in my hand is an early Terre Haute pressing, and for whatever reason, the Terre Haute pressings were on a different ABC label than the square ABC logo. This is what is called the blocks. They almost look like kids' play blocks. And again, this was pressed at the Terre Haute plant. Again, wide open soundstage, very lively, dynamic recording, great separation. I am really pleased that I have this in my collection. The better condition that you can find on these early pressings, the better kind of fidelity and enjoyment you're going to experience. There is little to zero surface noise on this album. You know, see what you can find, get it ultrasonically cleaned, and hope for the best. Now, I do have a second pressing. You can see that this has got a cut corner on it and a drill hole through that corner, meaning it was probably overstock and it was eventually discounted, maybe sold on to discount record chains so that it would not be a first run issue price. And that was how they did that back in the day to kind of signify that. And this is a later ABC label, you can see, but still I think in the first year of pressing, you know, maybe late 1973, possibly into 1974. But that's what that other ABC label looks like. Now, I've done a direct comparison between this pressing and the earlier ABC blocks pressing. I can tell pretty significantly that the blocks, it just sounds better to my ears. It sounds more lively. This is a little more dull, a little more lifeless. So take it with a grain of salt, but try and find the earlier ABC black label pressings if you can. Let's talk about the artwork for a minute. This has got this really weird, kind of surrealistic, you know, these aliens on the cover. There's 3 of them kind of sitting in lawn chairs. And famous story, apparently, well, this was by Donald Fagen's girlfriend at the time. And when it came time to get the artwork approved, the president of ABC Records said, wait a minute, there's 5 guys in this band. Why is there only 3 people? So she went in and faintly drew in 2 other figures here, kind of halfway. And this thing eventually passed as the final album artwork. Probably one of the most iconic photographs on the back cover of any Steely Dan album. And you will see, if you look very closely, there is kind of a disembodied hand right here. That is the hand of longtime engineer Roger the Immortal Nichols, passed away in 2011. But that is a famous photograph, one of my favorites. I think it was probably taken at Village Recorders. Earlier issues of the album included a really nice 2-sided lyric sheet. But one of the best parts of this thing, for instance, the Boston Rag. So every song is listed, and then Becker and Fagen had some wry commentary on the actual song. So the Boston Rag, enervated after an attack of unrelieved nostalgia, Jeff Skunk Baxter sheds his outer skin and stands revealed as a wild boy, capital letters, wild boy. On Boa Vista, Diaz, Denny Diaz, Diaz the bebopper meets Baxter the skunk beneath the bow tree in this altered blues. Fantastic commentary. Just kind of cementing the fact, America, this was the second album that they had received, or the world for that matter, from Steely Dan, clearly differentiating this outfit as something a little bit different than the norm. Next up, we've got Pretzel Logic. Pretzel Logic is an incredible album. It's a classic. It's a masterpiece, in my opinion. This album was released in February 1974, so the band actually kind of picked up the pace as far as their release scheduling went, and this came only 7 months after Countdown to Ecstasy. This is the album where Becker and Fagen really began to really kind of show their jazz appreciation big time. Famously, on Ricky Don't Lose That Number, there is a direct hat tip to Horace Silver's Songs for My Father in the opening riff. They also covered a Duke Ellington song. It's an instrumental. That was East St. Louis Toodaloo, which has got some incredible, back to Jeff Skunk Baxter, some incredible wah-wah guitar on it. Have a listen to that all the way through. Funnily enough, the gong at the end was by Roger Nichols, the lead engineer. This is just a tour de force. Here we go with the cliches. Sorry, but it is just, it's almost too much. I mean, this thing was reviewed incredibly well when it was released. It went to number 8 on the Billboard 200 eventually. Ricky Don't Lose That Number, the single, hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. And this was the last album to feature that original core group of 5 guys. Jeff Skunk Baxter famously went on to the Doobie Brothers. Denny Diaz kind of went back into the background, did session work. He would appear on other Steely Dan albums in the future. Jim Hodder went away. And it was then Walter and Donald's trained to drive, throughout the rest of their recorded history. This is the first album that really heavily featured a lot of session musicians that were brought in for various reasons to fill out different tracks, different expertises, different riffs. Timothy B. Schmidt came in, he played bass on 3 songs. Dean Parks was in playing guitar. Michael O'Martin, great piano player, was brought in for a couple tracks. So more and more. Jeff Porcaro eventually went on to be one of the best drummers in history. Of course, he was with Toto for years. But this is the first album that Jeff Porcaro appears on. He was on 2 different songs on this album. This is that vertical gatefold shot of the band. Kind of bittersweet because this is the last time that they would all be together, at least on one record. And there's some credits of all the additional players. Again, engineered by Roger Nichols. Produced by Gary Katz. Same cast of characters. And again, mainly recorded at the Village Recorders on the west side of LA. Iconic cover photograph taken in Central Park of the pretzel peanut vendor. Really beautiful photography. And let's talk about the pressings. So this album, first of all, Steely Dan were sticklers for great sound. They wanted the best sound possible. Sometimes that would come back to bite them, that we'll talk about later on. But they were always looking for the absolute best sound that they could reproduce, that they could put out to the public. And it's one of the reasons why they stopped touring after this album. This was it. They toured a little bit behind Pretzel Logic. I think their last gig was July 5th, 1974 at Santa Monica Civic Center. There's a very famous live version of Boda Vista that came out on the Citizen CD box set. I think it's out there on another comp somewhere. If you haven't heard that, it's well worth listening to. And, you know, one of the problems as far as Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were concerned with touring, in the early days, they were usually second or third billed. They weren't really headlining, so they really didn't have any control over the sound system, the gear. Sometimes they wouldn't even get a sound check, and they found it incredibly frustrating. There were some embarrassing performances out there, and so they decided to kind of rein it in, and they basically pulled a Beatles and a Brian Wilson and said, we're going to become a studio band, and we're really going to focus on our output moving forward from the studio. That, of course, would change in the early 1990s when Donald and Walter got back together. The title track from this album, Pretzel Logic, Fagen started playing that live again in clubs in New York City in 1989, 1990, 91. Eventually kind of became part of the New York Rock and Soul Review. Walter Becker was kind of brought back into the fold. Donald and Walter started talking. They started, you know, seeing the crowd reactions to these songs. And before you knew it, Steely Dan had put together basically the Steely Dan Orchestra and launched a tour in 1993. And Pretzel Logic had a lot to do with all of that happening. Pretzel Logic was mastered at a boutique mastering agency in the LA area called the Alan Zentz Mastering House. Alan Zentz was a famous mastering engineer. He worked for a couple of labels before eventually, you know, inkling out and forming his own mastering house. Now, Doug Sachs did the same thing at the Mastering Lab, and then we had Kent Duncan at Ken Dunn Recorders. So we had three kind of boutique mastering houses in the early to mid 1970s. And Steely Dan decided to go use Alan Zentz in the instance of Pretzel Logic. So the pressing that I have, and that is highly recommended, again, is an early ABC Records black label, and you want to make sure that you find the AZ for Alan Zentz, which is etched into the dead wax on both sides of the record. You want to make sure you see AZ. Again, you will be happy if you can find a really nice clean copy. They're out there. I recently picked this up on eBay for under $30. You just have to know what you're looking for. Occasionally, you might have to take, it might take a couple of emails with the seller to find out exactly what's in the dead wax. But I was able to kind of confirm that I had AZ in both sides. And I replaced an older reissue of this album with this, and this sounds incredible. Same as before, another highly regarded pressing that I have not heard is going to be the UK Probe issue as well. The fourth Steely Dan album, Katy Lied, was released in March of 1975. There is that spooky cover with the out-of-focus insect. And, you know, at this point in time, Steely Dan, Walter, and Donald, principally, had moved on to mainly using hired guns in the studio to help them realize their visions for these songs. Now, I do like the fact that Denny Diaz was back. You'll see him on the back cover here, but also you will see Michael McDonald, famous vocalist who, of course, went on to Doobie Brothers fame, but he is all over this album. You will also see a photo there of Jeff Porcaro, who played drums for all of the songs. This is another fine recording. But when we talk about the recording of this album, there is quite a story to it. I'm going to read from kind of an essay that I found online from Denny Diaz, speaking to the issues that they had in the final mix down and transfer to vinyl for the album. Mixing was an absolute nightmare. Every song was mixed at least twice, and not because we were being fussy. In fact, we had mixed the entire record before we realized that there was a problem. We were using the new DBX noise reduction system, which was supposed to give us a better signal to noise ratio than Dolby, and for some reason, the DBX units could no longer decode the mixes on tape. They sounded dull and lifeless, and no one could explain why. After all of the equipment had been properly aligned for each session. This was especially puzzling since each mix was played back immediately upon completion. How could the sound deteriorate so quickly? Even if there had been some awful mistake, it couldn't have happened the same way twice, and certainly not more than twice. So there's what Denny Diaz had to say about the issue. They took the tapes to Alan Zent's mastering house again. They had used Alan Zent's on the previous album, and the equipment at Alan Zent's couldn't handle the tapes for whatever reason, so they moved on to the other boutique mastering house in town, run by Kent Duncan, which was Ken Dunn Recorders. They were actually based in Burbank. They were able to make sense of the tapes and the mixes and come out with a quality final product. It's not exactly what Walter and Donald had in mind. They wanted something of higher quality. For whatever reason, it is what it is, and they did not want to go back and kind of reinvent the wheel and start over. So thankfully, we do have this thing as a final product, and the pressing that you want to find, there are two main pressings of note. This was the first time that Mobile Fidelity had put out a MoFi version, the first iteration of MoFi before the sale and the current version of Mobile Fidelity as we know it. But there is a MoFi pressing out there. However, the early ABC label pressings that have... This is my pressing. It's an early ABC, the concentric circle. ABC at this point in time, we're no longer using that black label, so this is the first pressing. You want to find this, and you want to find Ken Dunn, Kendun, stamped in the dead wax on side A and side B. This is the best sounding recording out there of this particular album. Again, my reference is, I haven't heard the MoFi. I would actually like to pick one up and listen to it. I saw it recently in a shop for $95. It didn't look in great condition, so I passed it by. So this is what I have right now, but I would like to hear that MoFi at some point in time. However, if you go rifling through the Hoffman forums and doing a little research, the consensus is still the early ABC pressings beat the MoFi. The MoFi has its high points, but overall, soundstage, separation of instruments, the clarity of the recording, people prefer the early ABCs. Standout tracks on this album for me, I love Black Friday, I love Bad Sneakers, Rose Darling is great. Daddy Don't Live in That New York City No More. Dr. Wu is a legendary song that, you know, when Steely Dan started playing live again in the early to mid 1990s, that was something that was amazing to hear. People wanted to hear it because remember, they did not tour behind this album at all. They were no longer touring when this was released in 1975. Everyone's Gone to the Movies, Your Gold Teeth 2, Chain Lightning, Any World That I'm Welcome to, and Throw Back the Little Ones. I just mentioned every track because they're all highlights to me. That is the fourth album, Katy Lied. May 31st, 1976 was the day that we received the fifth album from Steely Dan. Of course, that was The Royal Scam. And this album came a full 14 months after Katy Lied. This is the longest amount of time in between albums that we had seen as far as Steely Dan was concerned. That is kind of the foreboding atmosphere on the cover. And a close-up of the guy's shoes on the back cover. Love that artwork with the skyscrapers, presumably in Manhattan, having kind of a menacing feel to them. This album was really an album of the time. And it's really the only album of all of the Steely Dan albums where you can actually pick out influential things that were happening of the time. So 1976 in America, we were in the beginning to middle period of disco. Reggae was around. There was a lot of soul music and also some funk. And you're going to find all of those elements in this album. Right off the bat with Kid Charlemagne, the lead single from the album, with the incredible guitar solo by Larry Carlton, and an incredible drum track in the pocket by a fantastic drummer that they actually found in New York, Bernard Purdy. Bernard Purdy would go on to even greater heights with Steely Dan over the next couple albums. And, you know, something different with this album, they went to New York and laid down some of the basic tracks. They brought Larry Carlton with them from Los Angeles, flew to New York, did a bunch of recording time there, came back to LA, and finished up with Roger Nichols. And again, it's a fantastic album. It's really, believe it or not, but Fagan and Becker played the least amount on this album than any of their other albums. They really leaned on and relied on some of the great session players of the time on this album. Part of that sound, they wanted to have a heavier bass and heavier drum sound than they had on the previous two albums. So that's why they were kind of searching for who they found in Bernard Purdy. Now, also influential sound on this album, it's more of a funk feel and more of a soul feel. So they're moving away from acoustic piano, which was, you know, quite heavily featured on the previous two albums, and they found a fantastic session player named Paul Griffin, who was a wizard on Fender Rhodes and electric piano. Although he did have a fantastic piano part on Sign In Stranger. If you listen to Sign In Stranger, it's just got that rollicking piano solo throughout it, and something, it sounds like it's from out of New Orleans or something like that. Fantastic piece of music. And then the other cool part of Sign In Stranger is Elliott Randall is back on lead guitar. So Elliott Randall is a session guitar player of great note, and he handled that fantastic solo on the Reelin' in the Years song from Can't Buy Me a Thrill, the first Steely Dan album. So here he is again, 5 albums later, featured prominently. Now, Denny Diaz is also back on guitar. Walter Becker played some guitar as well and some bass, although they heavily relied on another fantastic session player, Chuck Rainey, on bass guitar. The album came with, the earlier issues of the album came with a really nice, heavy cardstock inner with all of the lyrics, and then we got this kind of weird double negative image of Donald and Walter on the front side of that. And my recommendation on the pressing is, first of all, this was mastered originally back at Alan Zent's Mastering in Los Angeles. And at this point in time, Alan Zent's had a hotshot lead engineer by the name of Brian Gardner. Brian Gardner is kind of a renowned mastering engineer in the business. He spent a lot of time at Alan Zent's before moving on to Bernie Grundman's mastering house, and then he eventually formed his own mastering house as well. I think he may be recently retired. I did a mastering engineer episode on the Alan Zent's mastering house, and there's a couple pressings that I mentioned that were handled by Brian Gardner. So Brian Gardner has kind of a unique signature in the dead wax. He has known to just do a BG in script form, but he is more famous for doing a very kind of intricate little sketch of a flower or twin birds in flight, also known as the seagull etching. So the flower and the seagull are famous etchings by Brian Gardner. Let's take a look at this early ABC pressing that I have. It's on the concentric circle again, and you know the mantra by now. Try and find a very clean copy. The one that I have currently is probably VG Plus. I have a couple hairlines in it, but nothing too crazy. And this is a very, very strong dynamic recording. This particular pressing on side A has got AZ and the flower symbol. And side B has AZ for Alan Zent's in script, followed by the two seagull etchings. So side A is a flower, side B is the seagull. I have another pressing here. Same ABC label, same AZ is etched in the dead wax on A and B, but I have the seagulls on both sides. There's no flower. Now, I've listened to both, and I feel that the pressing that has the flower and AZ on side A and then the AZ with the seagulls on side B sounds better. Just more upfront, in your face. Something telling, Brian Gardner has a nickname. He's actually known as Brian the Bassman Gardner. So he's known for a full soundstage, heavy bottom, but fantastic mids and highs as well. So the full spectrum is represented in his pressings, and this is one of the best sounding Steely Dan pressings that I have of any of the albums. It's fantastic. So that is what you want to try and look for. Look for the Brian Gardner pressing from Alan Zent's with AZ in the dead wax on A and B. If you can find a flower in A and the seagulls in B, you're in business.